Last week on The Transformationist, the topic of criticism versus critique came up in my conversation with April Diaz about mentors and guides and how we can invite people into our lives to speak with clarity and wisdom and sometimes constructive criticism on how we can continue our transformation journeys. This week, I went back to the source and we invited Jeff Crabtree, who first appeared on the show Season 1, Episode 5, to talk with us again about this idea of how we can use critique constructively, but the difference between the two and how we can listen and lean in to those critiquing voices in our life that actually can help sharpen us and make us better. It's a pleasure to have Jeff back on the show. We hope you enjoy this week's episode. Are you thirsty for inspiration and curious about the life-changing process of transformation? Welcome to The Transformationist. Whether you already know the transformation you're looking for or you're looking for guidance on the way there, these stories of hope will give you practical tips, plenty of encouragement, and an invitation into real, life-giving transformation, whether you're transforming culture or becoming more yourself. Your story is welcome here. And so in this week's episode of The Transformationist, a very special return appearance from one of my very favourite Australians, Mr. Jeff Crabtree. Welcome, sir. It's a pleasure to have you back.
Thanks, Tash. Yes, it's lovely to be back. It's lovely. It's an honour to be back, given that there's nobody else in that category.
Look, and it's really because you are absolutely brilliant, but I am a subscriber to your Zebra Collective emails, which I consider to be, and I know that I said this on the last episode, but I consider it to be probably one of the best things that lands on my inbox on a daily basis. And one of them landed into my inbox right before an episode an interview I was doing with April Diaz just last week. And it struck me so deeply that we ended up talking about it on the episode. And I immediately then had to reach out to you to talk about it because you sent me an email that said, now, and I might get this wrong because I got it wrong the other day, but basically said, what I thought it said was that criticism hurts more than encouragement heals, by which I thought you meant that actually sometimes a little bit of pain is worth it because it can actually do more good than encouragement. And so I reached out to you with this, what I felt was a profound thought, and you corrected me, which was excellent and brought us to this conversation. So what was the email actually saying?
Yeah, no, that's what it actually said. Criticism hurts more than encouragement heals, is what the actual email said. The difference between the two things that we got to that was a Marco Polo discussion, was because your point was that, criticism is helpful because it really helps us to understand ourselves from other people's perspectives. And then in our discussion, I came back and said, look, I make a big distinction between criticism and critique. Because it seemed to me that the sort of thing that I didn't hear the other podcast, but what you might have been canvassing is the notion that we need feedback from other professionals.
Yes.
And so that was where our Marco Polo discussion landed. And then you went, right, podcast again. So here we are.
Which is brilliant. Well, so first, before we leap into dissecting the whole thing, because I want to tell you a little bit about the conversation that I was having with April and how we got into then this idea of criticism versus critique, because I think you've got a unique ability to speak into that both as a musician and a producer, so somebody who in a very professional level is required to deal with critique. But I'm also just curious to know how are things, because when we last spoke, you were diving into the PhD work and you were going deeper and deeper into this idea of, what does health look like, or what does health look like in the creative industry. So how are things? Tell us first and foremost.
Well, that's a bottomless pit. That's a bottomless pit there, Tash. The PhD is a bottomless pit. I mean, I'm actually where that's at is I've completed collecting data. I've got maybe a handful of online surveys. So if there's anybody out there listening who's in music who's been experienced harassment, then www.musicharassmentresearch.org. It takes 10 minutes. I'm looking for about another 5 or 6 online surveys.
Okay.
But I have maybe something like 50 hours, close to 50 hours of interviews and transcripts that I'm reading. So every time I listen to one and go back, it sort of takes me back into that situation, and my own mental health is at risk because I'm hearing these stories of profound distress and profound inequality and disadvantage. And so I'm I'm in the process really at the moment of reading that and just going, trying to work out what the big themes are. The actual work of the Zebra Collective, wider than that, is going well. We've had a major contract with a major music company this last year, and we're looking at who else would like to take us on for consulting in the area of the well-being of creative thinkers. I've got Julie's appearing at a major media and arts conference in Melbourne in a couple of weeks. I've spoken at a small arts-related conference here in Sydney in early January. The year started pretty quickly, really. Haven't had a chance to. I had 2 weeks off in New Zealand. Can you believe it?
where once again our paths did not cross.
Once again, it's our paths didn't cross. But our paths would have crossed if you, like me, were climbing up what amounted to a near vertical cliff in the Fjordlands to sort of view this glacial lake that is only accessible by a near-death experience. We came straight back from that and had we were straight into it. So generally, I mean, it's the business of trying to help people with understand well-being for creative thinkers is it's a large undertaking. So I feel a little bit like Don Quixote, really. I don't, as in, am I deluded? Am I just charging at windmills, or is this really a noble pursuit? Well,
it's noble. No, it's noble. It absolutely is. It has to be. It has to be. Otherwise, we wouldn't. Lose the people that we lose, and we wouldn't be racked with the kind of subjective, coercive manipulation and dark, seedy underbelly of the creative arts. So it is noble. It must be noble because something must be done.
There you go. See here am I in my little studio / office, racked with self-doubt, and then I get on a podcast with you, and the first thing you do, part of the introduction, is encourage me, and then just brings us full circle to the subject matter, because suddenly I'm feeling like, your critique of my work, you're a professional, and so that suddenly what that does is just that makes my day. Thank you.
Well, I'm pleased and delighted to have done it. So, speaking of the subject of hand, let's get into it. So I was interviewing April Diaz, who also works in the space of transformation and coaching as I do, and I specifically was wanting to talk with her about the importance and the role of mentors and guides. We kind of dove a little bit into Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, the idea that that at moments of crucial interruption, there are people that we need to lean on, and then where that conversation went was, what's the difference between because we get quite real, and so we were discussing how important it is to have people in your life who will call you on your shit, who will say, hey, actually I think you're stepping out of line here, not just be the people who offer the encouragement, and so that was where I mentioned this email and this thought that was then reverberating, because part of then our conversation around the importance of mentors and guides is actually how do you do the hard work of inviting people to step into your space enough to give you that criticism that, whilst it might hurt, can actually help you be better. And that was where we got. And I'm not sure that we landed on an answer, which is why I wanted to have the conversation with you, because I think you've got some insight.
That's great. I was wondering what April thought.
Well, it was interesting because, as in her experience, she's a very bold, kind of confident person, and so she's really fostered relationships whereby people have permission to speak in, but they're people who have proven and built trust over the years, and so when we then got to this point of trying to talk about, well, what do you do? How do you put yourself in a space where you can receive criticism without defense? That was really where we landed, and we didn't find an answer for the other, simply because that's not really her story yet. And so hence I threw the doors open to you to say, hey, I think that this is important. I think it's an important part of the work of transformation. But there's a practice to it. I'm not sure if it's a skill. I don't know if you ever get good at hearing criticism, but I think it's a practice, and I think that it matters. And so, I'm curious to know what you think and what input you've got.
Yeah, I mean, it came from watching firsthand really unhealthy cultures where creative people were being cut down. And what seemed to me obvious in the environment that I was in is that you would the performances, and I'm not talking about musical performances, but the actual contributions and the performances that people would contribute to anything at all, any endeavor, were much stronger, much more committed, much more true and richer and more amazing when people felt they were working in an environment of encouragement, affirmation, and we're all in this together. That kind of band of brothers/sisters kind of idea. And what I was seeing persistently was a fear-driven culture in which anybody who stepped out of line was being cut down. And so people were still contributing, and they were still showing up and delivering what they had to deliver, but their underlying motive was fear that they would be exposed or humiliated. In fact, I saw a very, very public version of it, where large scale rehearsals, about 150 people, major event, and the guy who was directing the entire event was getting frustrated that nobody was listening to him. A lot of the reason that nobody was listening to him was because a lot of what he had to say was just twaddle, was rubbish, and self-aggrandizing. So, he was sort of getting ignored justifiably, but he did actually at some point lose his SHIT and say, look, the next person who's not paying attention when I'm speaking, I'm going to make them run around the building 5 times.
You weren't at primary school at the time, surely, because that's
a real primary school kind of thing. And then, sure enough, there was somebody who wasn't paying attention, but justifiably, there was a justifiable reason. And so they were inside the building. This is a large public space. They were running around in front of the other 150 cast members. And it was sort of, if it had been me and he told me to do it, I'd have just said, I'm out of here. See ya. Find somebody else. That would have been my response. I'm not sure why the person agreed to be humiliated and subjugated that way.
Right.
But I think it was out of that moment, and I started pondering the kinds of things that drive us to, particularly those of us in creative industries, or anybody who is trying to make anything something out of nothing, which is just about everybody these days. What drives us, and our passion drives us, our convictions drive us, and I think to a certain degree we're all motivated in some way, shape or form by some level of approval, And you certainly want the things that you make to get traction and be received and accepted and taken on board by your audiences. So that seems to be the overall dynamic. The reason, the reasons that you'd want to make something. What's really big about that is, I think, the passion and the deep sense of personal commitment and involvement that is required to make something out of nothing. To dream the impossible dream. To sort of try and reach the unreachable. I felt like what mostly then motivated the email was that thinking about how extraordinarily powerful it is creating a positive environment rather than a negative one. And implicit in that idea was a specific idea about criticism that I had, which was the notion of an uneducated, uninformed opinion, which in my mind is what happens all the time. I feel as if there's sort of like a kind of a gigantic cancerous growth on the television and media landscape in Australia today. I hope it hasn't come to New Zealand, but I'm sure it's worldwide, right? I mean, and it's the reality television, which makes people tune in every week because of the artificially generated drama that's engineered. And what you actually have is a bunch of amateurs, people who shouldn't be on television, and they're there proclaiming their opinions, and their reactions and their actions are sort of quite extraordinarily ill-informed. And I feel like that's what criticism is, really. It's the ill-informed ideas of the general public. And I feel like if you're actually making something, there's a degree of acceptance that whatever you do, if you're making art, for example, or if you're making food, or if you're making film, you're making music, not everybody's going to like what you do. So there are people who are just going to not like it. And some of the ways in which people don't like it is that they say they hate you. It's nonsensical, really, but it's classic. It's classic reality television induced kind of thinking, which is everybody's entitled to their opinion. That's what criticism is. The difference between critique and criticism comes down to the level of professional engagement and knowledge and understanding that the person offering the insight has. So there's one thing to be told let's say I write a piece of music it's a score for a film, and it's one thing to be told by let's say a truck driver who saw the film, got to wherever he was going, watched the film and hated the score, didn't like it, thought it was really crap. There's one thing to be told that, which is like, okay, fair enough, you didn't like it. There's another thing to be told that by the head of the Australian Guild of Screen Composers.
The qualification of the opinion is everything.
The qualification,
in some regards.
The qualification of the opinion is everything. And can I say that I feel like this probably goes to a larger question about how creativity works in society?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so how it works in society is that, you come up with a really good idea, you think, something that's never been seen before, never been heard before, and then you put the idea out there. The way that any new idea gets into the public arena is if somebody from the group of people who are sort of currently the gatekeepers for that area check it out and go, oh yeah, wow, that's great. It's they're the people who decide what makes it. Does that make sense? They're the people. It's like the equivalent. They're the equivalent of the people who's able to green light a movie. Who's able to say this book needs to be published.
Well, data scientists, basically.
These days, data scientists, yeah.
But data scientists who can predict the opinion of the common people, primarily, right?
Right. I'd say that's the 21st century answer. Somewhere in there still is a group of people who have a good sense of what's in the zeitgeist. They actually have a good sense of what's in the zeitgeist. They have a good sense of what people are looking for, what they want. And they also have a good sense of what makes great quality. And I think part of that sense comes from long experience in the field, long experience working in the discipline, enough experience of looking at what's good and what's bad to be able to go, that's amazing. And you don't come to that straight away. It's a little bit like, putting a well-peated single malt in front of a kid who's only drunk Coke and then asking him to go, what do you think? It's a developed the sense of taste that you need to be able to judge good from bad is a developed thing.
How did you know that I was currently drinking a peated Belvini double wood? It's delicious.
I didn't know that you were actually doing that, but I mean, the other thing is I tend to send emails that are reading everybody's mail. I have got when you sent the email, say, "What are you reading my mind?" I've got a lot of people who email me back, go, "What are you reading my mind today, or what?" I think that no, I just feel like maybe that's an example of why I'm a good person to offer critique.
Yes. There you go. Well, it's interesting as you describe that and you talk about longevity and you talk about the development of taste, because I just watched the Grammys show here in the States just last week or whenever it was. And I didn't watch the whole thing, but there's a reason why the Lifetime Achievement Awards, apart from, the key being lifetime, but there's a reason why some of those Lifetime Achievement Awards go to figures like Dolly Parton. She was the Music Cares Person of the Year, I think. Right. But that kind of award goes to somebody who can then be recognised broadly across all categories as being somebody of expertise, somebody who is qualified to give an opinion, not just in country music, but in many different aspects of music and the business and all of those things, simply because she's done the time and therefore seen so many changes and encountered so many parts and aspects of the industry, which is why then she can be applauded by people who are selling into the millions of albums in the hip hop space and in the R&B space and and all of these other spaces that are facets of the music industry, but they're not necessarily her lane. Her time and trajectory in the business sets her kind of to a place where she can actually be informed and qualified on some of those things. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. That's part of its longevity. I mean, I think every person who you would turn to for critique, or any person that you would turn to for critique as opposed to criticism, their pathway to that position of trust will be different, and so in her case, I mean, exactly as you described it, she's crossed so many boundaries, crossed so many genres, even though she had this sort of kind of extraordinary career in country music. Her music's been taken up by so many other artists, and she has a lot to say. So I feel like she has a lot, and she has a lot to offer, and that that's why you would want the opinion. I think critique is really just incredibly well-informed opinion, and despite the taste making being made by data miners and artificial intelligence, I'm old school enough to believe that there is something about the way the humans process information and the way we turn new ideas out of old ones that was probably not going to go away anytime soon. And the world of academia is a classic example of that. You do hear critical thought all the time. The entire process of academia and the social sciences is described as a discourse, that's how they like to think of it. They think of it as an ongoing discussion. And so when I release my findings, that will be a part of a discourse. It's not like say, for example, science, where I've discovered a new element or or astronomy, where I've discovered a new star or a new, or I've found something that unravels Hubble's constant, or whatever it is. In the social sciences, which is the field that we're really talking, that I'm really sort of embedded in. There's a discussion going on, and it's a discussion between people who have got a good reason to be contributing the ideas that they're contributing.
And what's the semblance of that conversation? I mean, the discourse is kind of based around, what's going on, what's really going on, is that good or bad, and how do we make it better? Is that the framework of the conversation?
It depends on which field you're in. I mean, and it depends on which part of the field you're in. So in academic world, things are very, very narrow. So, there'll be a conference, for example, around gender in the music industry, and how that's playing out. So that's a very, very specific conference. There'll be another conference that's about a specific band. And so it's played out. The discourse is actually played out at people who attend conferences and then release papers. That's the actual, if you're to find out, they're the venues, and they're the mechanisms. And then they're very specific and very tightly focused, because I think the general thrust of what's going on in the academic world is trying to refine our understanding and be much more clearer about things, and then particularly find out the nature of what is actually happening, and then also then being able to understand it, define it, describe it, and then relate cause and effect, those sorts of things. But just the point is, in social sciences, it's not a fixed point. It's a constantly evolving thing. And the people who are involved and engaged in the discourse, I mean, that you don't have much to say. They're not really listening to you if you put something out there and then nobody engages with it. They ignore you. So,
oh, absolutely. I was just going to say, I heard a passing comment the other day that if you write a book about failure and nobody reads it, is the book a success?
Well, the book is emblematic of the subject matter.
Well, one proves oneself an expert by the very
failing.
Exactly. So there was something that you said as I've gone on that journey of, okay, now I've got this correct definition in my mind, which is that it's the critique that is actually helpful. It's the critique that actually can be more healing than encouragement. Because as much as I wish it had been the case that encouragement has led me to all of my own best, personal growth and development, the truth is it really isn't. It's been the really heartbreaking and awfully gritty critique that I've had to somehow take on board and then grow through that has helped me become, better, imperfect but better, refining with age all the time, I like to say. There was something that you said, Jeff, about who you turn to for critique, and that is the piece that I'm fascinated by. How does one, in your opinion, develop the gumption, the grit, the ability to learn how to turn to people for critique in a culture that is so driven by criticism, which is nothing to do with the work itself and more lobbing personal insults across the hallway?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think criticism is like critique is like a surgeon's scalpel. You're right. That's a great. When you described it as a scalpel, that's correct. Critique is like a scalpel, and criticism is like a shotgun blast to the back of your head. So, you can't, the secret of it is, I think, growing older, and sort of caring less about what the general masses think about you, and sort of coming to terms with that. That's a hard thing when you're younger.
But it can't be impossible.
It's not impossible. No.
It has to be possible.
No, and I mean, people who operate sort of large-scale creative enterprises, I'm thinking in the arts, who are younger, generally have management who insulate them from criticism, and they go, look, you just let me handle all this stuff. But the answer is you must have around you people who you trust, who you value, and who you respect. I mean, that's the first thing. You've got to have people who, when they speak, because it's brutal, by the way.
I'm sitting here recounting and recalling my own experiences, so I know I feel the old scars opening up even as I think about it.
I am. I just have this memory of writing this music much when I was much younger, and falling in love with it. I think anything that you make, anything that's a product of your own sort of inner world, there's a part of you that falls in love with it, and you have to, otherwise you don't make it. I mean, so you produce this thing, and it's like you've given birth to this baby, and then of course somebody walks into the room and says, "Oh, that's complete crap." Well, your first reaction is defensiveness. And in fact, actually, your first reaction to any opinion that you don't like is defensiveness. We all have this kind of confirmation bias, which is we do, which is this idea that we only really turn to, we only accept a belief or an opinion that reinforces what we already believe. So I feel like the battle is to overwhelm the confirmation bias. Is to be able to go, how do I cope with people who don't agree with what I'm thinking, whose opinions challenge me, and that's a brutal experience. The first time it ever really happened to me, it was actually my wife, and she just said to me, "Oh, yeah," and she pointed out how it was. I'd written this piece of music and I thought it was wonderful and amazing, and then she just went, "Oh, but it's this and it's that, and that's a cliche, and this is the other thing." She was brutal. And my first reaction was just anger and frustration and denial. But actually, pretty quickly that passed, because I knew that she hadn't walked into the room to cut me in two. That she actually loved me and cared for me and wanted me to do well. And so I feel as if that's the qualification. You need people who love you and care for you and want you to do well. And you need people who love you and care for you and want you to do well, who've got good ears or good eyes or good sense for what it is that you're trying to accomplish. So it's not enough that people love you, but they also have to be informed enough to be able to offer informed commentary and informed observation. Because we're never able to, truth of it is, we're never able to see ourselves clearly, and we're never able to see the work we do clearly. We're all too emotionally attached. We're too emotionally attached to our own identity. We're too emotionally attached to our own sort of the narrative we have of our own lives. We're too emotionally attached to the things that we make out that emerge from that identity and that narrative. And there'd be something wrong with you if you weren't really. So the natural defensiveness that you have against the shotgun blast is great, because you need to be able to insulate yourself against all of that sort of uninformed opinion. But at the same time, you have to have people who can step around your own defenses to point out things that you're not noticing. And so I feel like one of the journeys that I went on with this, apart from the first one being, the first experience of it being my wife, who, was ruthless. But gradually I became better at it. I would present stuff to her and then steel myself for the remarks. But then you value it then when somebody says, "Oh no, that's really great," because they've already proved themselves willing to point out where the problems are. The thing about it is, sooner or later you'll fall out of love with that thing anyway, and you'll come back to it yourself and go, "Oh, there was a problem with that." Like, in any process, you sort of, creative process, or you're making something, you'll fall out of love with it a little bit later on. And I feel like what critique does is help you fall out of love with it enough to go, "I need to fix that, I need to work on that, or I need to trim that or remove that or add this." It's a kind of a weird process of educating yourself to be completely and utterly, passionately, unrealistically involved and in love and utterly submerged in the work or whatever it is, and then be able to step back from it and be somewhat dissociative, as if you're looking at it sort of critically with one part of your mind. There's sort of no middle ground, really. You've got to go from one to the other. And what critique does is help you make the shift. And if you're not able to make the shift, it makes the shift for you and goes, yes, this is really great, but ... this is a problem here and that's a problem there. So it's, I feel it's trust, and it's, people have to love you and they have to believe in you, but they also have to be informed enough in the field so that their observations are valuable, and they're just not somebody who loves you saying nice things. And so you really got to intentionally go out of your way and find those people. They can be, and they'll be everywhere. It's just a question of finding them and then engaging with that process, because you might think, oh, this person's going to be really great for me, and then you find they're not really invested in you, or they don't spend the time, or they don't care enough about you. I feel as if they really care about you, they will be completely honest when you're asking for it, and they'll take the risk that the relationship could be damaged by an honest moment of feedback. They take the risk. They'll go, I value this person enough to take the risk. Does that make sense? It's quite a complicated thing. The other part of that story for me is I came to it also through collaboration and collaborating with great colleagues, because what's happening is everybody in the room is vulnerable. And then I also learnt in that process, I was in a band with 3 or 4 other guys, and we were making this music that was incredibly improvisational, and you were sort of very vulnerable, and we'd make it all we'd record these songs in a whole album in a studio in like a day and a half or 2 days. And you are putting yourself right out there, but everybody's putting themselves right out there. And so there's a real even playing field. And then there wasn't a sense in which somebody was going to say something to you in order to cut you down and lift themselves up. What there was generally there was this ethos going on in the room where everybody knew that what we were trying to accomplish was the best possible version. And in that kind of environment, I learned a lot about hearing critique and hearing and adopting ideas from other people who'd sort of come to me, who'd come to my work and gone, yeah, but what if you do this, and what if you add that, and what if you change this? Because I learnt in that environment to trust their motive. So we come back to trust again, aren't we?
Well, and trust and intention. And
yeah.
oftentimes that rule of positive intent, assume at all times that the intention behind this is positive, is something that has stood me in good stead. It's also something that I think has at times allowed me to take, carte blanche criticism, something that has just been, a pot shot across the bow, so to speak, and to take that and then to try and find some truth in it that I can actually use as critique, which I think is I don't know if it's a particularly healthy thing, but is something that I've learned to do from a young age. This, that idea of being able to take those experiences, which can sometimes be confrontational at first, learn to see what the good intention may be and take something therefore meaningful, out of it. But I think that is a hard path. And I love the idea that you talk about collaboration as being, one of the ways of unlocking that ability, because I don't think it's something that we're naturally born with, the ability to hear something hard and do something good with it.
No, I mean, I think the natural reaction is defensiveness. That's a natural reaction,
Yeah, I'm curious because of your work, you will have found yourself both being somebody who seeks critique, but also is asked for critique. And so, what happens when the tables are turned? What have you learned about critique through the practice of giving it? Is there something that you've noticed about that's worthwhile for us to think about or talk about?
Yeah, what I learned one thing I learned recently is that if people don't respect you, they're not going to hear anything that you say. So there are a number of variables, and one of them is how much respect they hold you in. And I've been in a situation recently where I made the mistake of thinking a person actually held me in higher respect than they actually did, and the whole discussion in sort of dissolved into acrimony pretty quickly. So I feel like respect is you have to know that you're respected. Otherwise, people will be asking you for your opinion, asking you to contribute your ideas, contribute your thoughts, but they don't really think of them as being important. They don't. So that's a big one. I've learnt to converse with people who are who've invited me to comment in a very gentle way. Under normal circumstances, that's the way I prefer to work.
What are the hallmarks of gentleness for you?
I would be saying things like, I would be asking questions more than making statements. One of those, for me anyway, I would be saying, how would you feel about ... What would you think about this? Is there a possibility of ... Is there I'm just giving you some sort of sample starting. Is there a universe, or is there a world in which ... Is there I say, how would you feel if I was to offer some thoughts? I always start with those sorts of, even when I'm having the discussion, it generally is peppered with a lot of pulse checking activity. Yeah, also because I do a lot of sort of Skype or FaceTime consulting, and so that allows me to check things like people's reactions to the moments. So it's there's a lot of I don't jump in with both feet. I sort of try and go there gradually. There's a lot to be said for if I feel like I've got a difficult or a challenging thing that I would like people to come to. If I've got a big idea, I like to try and work to it gradually. So there's sort of almost like a logical progression.
Is there ever, do you find yourself, because this was something that again came up in my conversation with April, this idea that you can build a group of people around you who will offer critique without invitation, and I'm curious about that, because I think we talk about that. With kind of a thinly veiled kind of hat tip to authenticity, that if we all somehow live authentically, that somehow makes us more capable or gives us permission, not just to have people speak into our lives when we invite them, but that, if you have those people around you, so whether that's in creative work or just in living, that if you have those people around you, that you can trust them to take it upon themselves to speak into your life when necessary. But I'm not 100% convinced that that's true. But I'm not firmly convinced one way or the other. I'm more curious, is there anybody, would you now speak or offer critique without invitation?
No, I wouldn't. Because the very thing that you're talking about, I wonder whether or not it's sort of, that's an unusually close set of relationships. I'm the only person who successfully offers critique into my world is my wife, and she as well to me. All my kids actually, who are adults and are frequently critiquing, but they do it. It's a long established relationship. These are these are foundational relationships. This is these are the people I've lived with for the last 25, 30 years, so that's a pretty profound and serious relationship. So I don't offer critique unless I'm invited. I've been in some look. I'm going to say there's a caveat. I've been in some situations where people have actually put stuff in the table and they feel like they're inviting critique, but they haven't. And then so I'll offer I'll ask, are you interested in some thoughts here? And they'll go, yeah, but I'm sort of judging the whole moment, even as I'm having that discussion, like ready to back out if at the first sign of freaking out. I mean, and then what I try and do is help them to see something really great about their work as much as to offer this possibility that it could be better. I've had some situations where I've been invited to have critique. I know that this is not strictly speaking answering your question, because to strictly answer your question, what I would say is I suppose I'm sitting on the fence. In the way that you are, I've seen plenty of situations where people have constructed environments where everybody says, look, I've got everybody around and, this is the group. You can speak into my life whenever you want. But frequently I've found that even in those circumstances, when people have made that offer, they don't really want it. They're saying that. And then I've been in other situations where,
well, they get the vulnerability badge if they say it. If they say it, they get the vulnerability badge. They get the humble badge. But it's actually following through on that requires all of the grit and the humility.
Yeah, well, the pain, really. So I've been in situations where the other side has been true, which is, look, we're going to have, a great sort of radical honesty and accountability here. And then what I've found is those situations were more or less aimed at offering criticism actually against one individual and then preserving leaders from it, if that made sense. It was all unidirectional and was directional away from the people who orchestrated it. And so I'm a bit because I'm a bit suspicious of human nature. I think if left to our own devices, we descend into Lord of the Flies.
Well, we choose to believe the best about ourselves and the worst about everybody else. I think is our default narrative, which allows us to escape the need for dealing with critique, on that deeply personal level. But then as soon as it becomes about work or about, creativity, then I think there's another extra complex layer of humanity that starts to come into play. Right. I mean, I have a couple of mantras that are the shorthand versions of describing my worldview. And one of them is, it's a bell curve, which is, you can understand human nature by understanding the bell curve. And then my other shorthand thing is Lord of the Flies, which is that famous novel. Mm-hmm. It's a kid's novel. It's not really a kid's novel, but it's about a group of kids who get marooned on an island. I'm just talking to all the millennials and the Generation Z who might not have read this. And in a sense, these kids were meant to sort of create this beautiful utopia because they hadn't been spoiled by the world. But what happens is, even after a couple of weeks of being marooned, their worst natures emerge. And anyway, so I think Lord of the Flies is and the bell curve apply in a lot of those artificially constructed situations. I have two stories that I want to tell, I think, about critique. Where I was invited to give it, and one was an entire organisation that was an arts organisation, and they were sort of all it was a community-minded volunteer group, and they invited me to come to their national executive and speak to them, and so they asked me to develop some thoughts to offer on their future, and I did, and I just. I feel like I'm getting a sense for how it all turned out already.
I wasn't invited back. Let's put it that way. I mean, I actually offered what I felt was a crucial question, which is for them to actually consider completely everything that they're doing. I felt like, what is your function, and what are you actually doing? And it was like the fish slapping dance in Monty Python, when suddenly the big guy gets the big fish out and whacks the other guy, the little guy, and he falls off the edge of the pier and into the water. It was a moment they were deeply offended. And then this other story in which I was invited, actually, for a number of years, to be on a panel of people who were critiquing songs at a music conference. This was in the US, actually, and I would sit in a room at this music and arts conference, and people would put their songs into like the CDs, and this was in the days of CDs, they would put their CDs and their song lyrics into a box, and there was a room of about 250 people, and there was me and then somebody who was a very, I suppose, pastoral, community-minded person from from the parent organisation. She was sitting next to me, and then there were two producers from New York, and then the guy who was running it, and there was me. And the instructions we had were this: be honest, be truthful. Be kind, but be honest and be truthful. There's no point in helping, in sort of soft soaping people whose work isn't up to the scratch, because the argument was they've paid to come to this, they've paid to hear critique, and so there's me. The four of us are all nodding, So we all file into this room, 250 people, and I got a bunch of friends who were sitting down the front, and they pick this first piece of music out of the box. And honestly, it was it was woeful. It was awful. And we all everybody sat through it uncomfortably. And the guy who was the moderator of the whole thing had actually explained how the critique was going to work. He actually gave the room the same set of instructions that he'd given us,
Wow.
Right? Okay.
This is reality TV before reality TV.
It's exactly. This was at the same time as American Idol.
Right.
And I quickly became known as Simon Cowell. Actually, that gives you an idea how this went. But what happened was I listened to this piece of music, and I'm sitting there. In my head, I'm going, "What the heck am I going to say that is positive or polite?" It was awful. So anyway, fortunately, they handed it to the woman, the caring pastoral person, and she said, "Oh, I love your heart. I hear what you're doing. When I hear that music, I just hear your heart, and I just want to encourage you to keep going and just do what you're doing. And I just so love your heart." And it was like that, She went on, and I'm out of the corner of my eye looking at these two New York producers next to me, who are two African American guys who looked hipper than I will ever look. And I was looking at them, and they were looking at me and I'm going, "Dude, they better ask you next, because I don't know what to say to that." And they were looking at me with the same expression, And these guys are really hip too, by the way, and they were really great producers. And then so immediately they turned to these two guys, the two producers, and said, "What do you guys?" And they just said, "Oh, well, we don't have anything much to add to that," And I went, "Oh, thanks." So they handed it to me, and I just said this. I said, "Look, in songwriting, there are four elements of a song. There's the melody, there are the lyrics, there's the chords, the harmony, and the rhythm in which you hear these things." And I said, and there are well-established ways of understanding what amounts to a good quality lyric. There are good well-established methods of understanding and knowing what amounts to a good quality lyric, good techniques for good quality lyric, good techniques for good quality melody, good techniques for putting good chords together, And I basically went through these four things very briefly. And I said, and in your song, I can hear none of those techniques. And she started to cry. She was standing up. There's a room of 250 people. Oh. She started to cry, and then choked it back, and then nodded. And I said, and so talk to me afterwards. The room went quiet. Talk to me. I said, talk to me afterwards. I feel like it's absolutely possible for you to learn any of these techniques, all of these techniques, and then be able to take whatever songs you're writing to make them, to improve them. So I said to this woman in public, I said, "I realise it feels like you just presented me with your baby, and I've just, told you this is the ugliest baby alive." I said, "However, the thing is that your songs will be better once you learn what these techniques are and how to apply them." And she looked at me and nodded, and then the whole room broke out in applause. So that whole session went for an hour. at the end, she came up to me and sought me out, and she said, "Thank you so much for being so honest." She said that was hard to hear, but she said, "Everybody just says nice things to me, and I know that there are problems with it, but I don't know what to do." And I sort of pointed her in some directions of where you could go to learn songwriting, you know. So, yeah, there are two stories. One I was never invited back, and the other one in which I sort of gained this unenviable reputation of being the brutal guy.
But what the songwriter gained was the help that she'd been looking for, right?
Right. And then exactly. And then the other thing that happened was there was this in that very same session, went for an hour. I mean, we got to hear about 5 or 6 songs. We got to the very last song was an absolute cracker. And I listened to it, and they came to me first, and I just said, I can't think of anything else to say about this song except I really love it. It's fabulous. I think it's just got so much juice. Well, the place erupted because if I've demonstrated that I demonstrated throughout the hour that I was fair-minded, that I had a set of standards and a set of principles that I was applying that were real and genuine, and then I was able to point to some specific things in that final song. They went, yeah, wow, okay, so this is for real. I haven't forgotten that.
And I think that is probably at the crux of it. If I think that we throw criticism around way too liberally, and we don't know what to do with it. And it's hard to make criticism useful because it's generally uninformed and unqualified. But critique is actually a heavy thing. When you were talking before about the few foundational relationships that you have where people might offer critique without invitation, what I was thinking about in that moment when you were talking about it was actually it's because taking the opportunity to critique somebody comes with a hefty responsibility. I mean, there's an emotional burden that you carried on that day, speaking the hard truth to a woman who probably didn't want to hear it, but that's the weight of what you carry when you offer critique or when you bring critique to someone. And then on the converse, when you ask for critique, if you choose well, you know that you're actually asking people to do a heavy thing because they can wound you, they can hurt you, they can tell you something that you don't want to hear.
Yes.
But
totally.
But it's a brave thing, and that's I think the thing, right? Criticism is so lightweight. What is it that they say? To today's newspapers, tomorrow's fish and chips, or at least they used to.
Right. Well, yes.
Back when we had newspapers.
Yes, back when we had fish and chips.
Yeah, but there is something about that. That the throwaway nature of criticism. I'm curious, as we round it out, is there one particular moment of critique for you that has been particularly shaping in your creative work, or that has been transformative?
Wow, that's a really good question. Now I'm thinking about that. While I'm thinking about that, I want to say. I so agree with that, with your parsing of critique and criticism, that there's a responsibility. I so agree with that. I think maybe that's one of the defining things, and that's something I haven't articulated before. But yes, there's a responsibility. Now, I think, and you're right to say that criticism is so lightweight; it's very casual. I think criticism, might say more about the person who's offering it. Than the work. And it's to do with really what the intention. I think the intention of the intention of critique is to improve the work, and I think the intention of criticism is to improve the person who made the critical observation. I feel like criticism, the end goal of critique is to disappear in the improved work, that the improved work lives. Does that make sense? So that's another way of articulating the responsibility issue.
Yeah, that's I think utterly profound, actually. For people who are for people who aspire to become the highly regarded, to become, the critic, for example, that actually, the goal is, and if I translate this into the work of food writing and what it is to be a food critic, and the number of food critics who actually themselves become the story and themselves become, the all-defining paradigm, as opposed to the story and the experience of the chef or the restaurant or the creative work that they're trying, to do. And that's the moment where it becomes very hard to take a food critic seriously, because they've inserted themselves so far into the actual critique that it loses its substance. And that's what I think you're saying, really, about the disappearing into the work becoming better, becoming more. That is an idea that will sit with me for quite some time.
Yeah, I think that comes from the responsibility, the thing that you articulated about responsibility. I think that's where that comes from. That is the responsibility I feel that you carry when you're critiquing, and I don't think that people who criticise who are using criticism, I don't think they're carrying any responsibility, except that they want to be heard. I'm still struggling with trying to find a defining moment. I'm trying to think of some. I remember I think I've had a couple of people who've mentored me creatively in different areas. My current supervisor, my current PhD supervisor, would critique my writing. These days he just looks at it and doesn't say very much, which is normally a good sign. But he supervised me for my master's degree, and he would just ask questions. Why? Like, he would circle a whole bunch of writing and go, why? Well, what's the point? So he was slapping me over the head, in the academic way. I think in creative terms, critiquing has come from people who've mentored me. A couple of older guys who are great music producers, who would. I'm sort of trying to think. There's one in particular I'm trying to think of, but nothing that he said was not peppered with 4-letter words.
We handle a bit of that on this podcast from time to time, but if you can imagine those moments, where he just turns to you and goes, what do you think you're doing? Except it went on for a lot longer than that. Owing to the extra words. His anger and his frustration was not and part of that was I would work with him on projects, and there was this, he was a live recording engineer, and there was one song that we were working on together. He was mixing it. It was a live recording. It was a Dr. Bob thing, actually, and we were mixing on an automated desk, and the whole thing. And he got this particular song, and he was halfway through pulling a mix together, and he goes, "This isn't working." He stood up, he deleted all the automation, and he stood up and he took hold of all the faders with his hands, and he essentially danced and mixed the song live, pushing things up and back, like a piece, like actually composing a piece of music. And he was literally moving the faders with his hands all the way through to the end, and went, "I'm not going to get a better mix than that." And but he was dancing the whole time. It was like he was so totally engaged in the music, and I felt like I learned a great deal from those sort of moments, And I think I'm just trying to think of a moment where I had a moment. I'll probably wake up at 2 a.m. and go, "Oh yeah, there was this." Well, you can send me a message and tell me, and we'll add it to the producer's notes at the end.
I was so convinced about the power of actually having a lot of collaborative thinkers. When I was, at one point, I was running a community arts college, and I had a production, and I was producing and directing and had written these theatrical productions, sort of musical theatrical productions. And one of the ones that actually in the end became quite well known and quite successful in the world that I was working in at the time. the first time we ever ran it, I would have this process during rehearsals where I would get everybody who was at the top of the department. Well, I would subdivide the entire thing into different departments. Like there was an acting department, there was a music department, there was a production department, there was dancing, so there was visual art. So everybody who was responsible for something creatively, in a sense, had their own production team, and they would essentially work on their bits, and then we would assemble it. And at the end of all the rehearsals where we were putting this thing together, after all the cast had gone home, I would have all the team leaders sit around and go, okay, where are we going wrong?
Mm-hmm.
What are our problems? What are our problems? And, and that was for me a great way of, and I would sit there and you would have people telling you, oh, this is crap. And, and it was, you basically had to take it on the chin. And the best part of the process, I think, when we would do a preview show where we had 12 or 15 people who were completely random, completely, Joe Public, and we would bring them in and do a preview show and then hear their thoughts and hear their comments. And I think maybe those times were really amazing for me because it's amazing even when you have a group of people who you've given them permission, come on, where are we going wrong? Come on, where are we going wrong? And even then you would still miss it. And then you would have your preview audience would come in and go, I don't understand this and what's happening here and what's going on. And then I would take their criticism back, or the critique, I would take their critique back to the group. And then we would wrangle it, But what was fascinating was how much groupthink there still emerges, even in that.
Mm-hmm.
To the extent that in one terrible episode of this particular production that we did, the final moment was meant to be a tear-jerking moment of great power and passion and seriousness. And instead, this was the opening night, the entire audience laughed in the final moment, right? It's completely the wrong thing. And I'm sitting there and there's 1,000 people in the room, and I'm sitting there and it's like you want the earth to open up and swallow you, and everybody's supposed to be sitting on the edge of their chair with tears in their eyes. Instead, they're crying. And instead of crying, they're laughing. You go, I've completely failed. Anyway, we sort of got through it somehow. I forget how. I sort of went blank for a while, and I got all of the team backstage, and I go, how come nobody saw that?
Mm-hmm.
How come nobody saw that coming? And they all said to me, even our preview audience didn't see that coming. And I went, yeah, you're right. But that stayed with me as that's probably not exactly the answer you're looking for, but it was like for me, and it was incredibly instructive that you just can never assume anything when it comes to that sort of thing. And there's in those sort of processes, I feel like every time you take on board critique, you are minimizing your chances of failure. You're minimizing your chances of people laughing when they should have been crying, or crying when they should be laughing.
That is profound. That is profound. I think the other thing that the story about the laughing audience tells us is that critique must have a moment of introducing something new and unexpected to us. The unseen thing. That's the power of critique. It brings the unseen thing to light, and then allows us to do something with it, which is powerful.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Sir, I am always grateful and honoured when you take the time, and the conversations are always meaningful.
Thank you, Tash. I feel like we've just gone well over 45 minutes too. I think that's the other thing.
Yeah, but it's all the good stuff. It's all the good stuff. I look forward to our next conversation, whether it's spurred by one of your emails or one of mine. This has been for me personally a really helpful conversation about evaluating criticism and critique in my own life. So I'm thankful for that, and I hope that everybody else finds it just as helpful.
Oh, thanks, Tash. You're very kind. You're very kind. It's been fun.
All right, and we will see you. We'll see you and the Zebra Collective again shortly. Hi, it's Tash, and it's time for the credits. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Transformationist. Please subscribe, rate, and review this episode wherever you listen to it, and share it with a friend. Visit thetransformationist.org for links to the resources mentioned in this episode and to subscribe to our email updates. You can also share your transformation story with us there, and I would love to hear from you. As always, this episode is produced by Michael Yoder at Truthwork Media. Music is by Hans Van Vliet. For more about me and the transformation work I do, check out the website. This show is proudly made possible by Solar Feeder Consulting.